Hello friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CEC EduSet Network. Today we are starting a lecture series on political thoughts, and today's topic for lecture is Political Thoughts of Plato. For this we have our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. He has been teaching since last 25 years and he has specialized in Indian politics and political thought. So now I am welcoming Dr. Jha for lecture.
In fact, today's lecture we are going to have on political thought, particularly Greek political thought, and what I will try to do in next 50 to 55 minutes is to focus on one important Greek political thinker, that is Plato. But it is also important at the same time to see that how Plato's political thought evolved in the context of Greek social and political situation, and what were the influences on Plato and his contemporaries. Because it is well known that even today when we discuss political thought, it is rather difficult to even discuss any issue without having a reference of Greek political tradition. And when we talk of Greek political tradition, what comes to our mind immediately is the political thought of Plato and Aristotle, the two great minds of that period. But Plato in fact is also stands out in terms of laying foundation of certain trends in political thinking which even have continued till now. For example, later on in modern period, one method which became quite popular was the method known as dialectics, and it was Plato who is credited with the view of laying foundation for this dialectical method in thought and in basically political thinking. So, not only dialectics, but there are number of political trends which were set into force or set into operation by the Greek thinkers, and Plato was definitely pioneer among the Greek political thinkers of that period. But one thing is very significant, that when we talk of the Greek political thought, then we have to basically keep in mind the situation which was prevailing at that time. As it is well known that the Greek society was known as self-sufficient or self-reliant society, and as we know it, it was the city states. They were not the states in modern sense of the term. They were small in terms of their population, they were small in terms of interaction, they were also basically different in terms of this entire concept of citizenship, people's participation in governance, and so on and so forth. So, their basically lifestyle was different, the conditions which informed their life were different, and therefore, the kind of problems which they had to encounter were different from the problems which we have encountered in the modern period of the time. But one thing we should remember, that what happened at that time, that some of the challenges which were thrown to these thinkers, particularly in terms of their engagement with the social and economic and the political reality of that period, that led to a kind of reflection, and some of the reflections have been so powerful and so imaginative that even their value is acknowledged even today when we talk of political theory or political thought, whether it is justice or it is citizenship or it is the discussion of government or the constitution. We often go back to the Greek period, whether it is Aristotle or his mentor Plato, or for that matter many other Greek thinkers who basically preceded these two people, and their ideas are still referred, they are discussed and they are considered while basically dealing with our own problem. So, that way one can say that the Greek political philosophy, Greek political tradition, and Greek entire political thinking in the Greek period, ancient Greek period, were so rich, so basically profound, that its influence has not diminished over 2000 years in our history. So, that way in fact this is the value and the significance of Greek political thought. When we discuss classics, even political thought, we often refer to the classics, and at times when we discuss political thought, we start our discussion with this this posture, that why do we study classics. And it is normally understood that in science, after every few years, after 10 years or 20 years, you have basically a kind of paradigm shift. There is a kind of revolutionary break, but in human sciences, in social sciences, in political thought, in political theory, we do not have that type of situation as it exists in natural science. And therefore, some of the knowledge, some of the wisdom which they basically generated and created and handed over to the posterity, that is considered even today as significant for understanding our social and political reality. Therefore, this is perhaps the significance of studying classics. And when we talk of classics, then the political thought of Plato and Aristotle definitely are perhaps most significant. Now, coming to this political thought of Plato, one thing is very important, that what was the situation in which Plato was writing, what were the influences on Plato. There were many influences on Plato, as it happens with every political thinker, because political ideas and political thinking, they are not done in vacuum. There is always a kind of tradition which precedes a particular thinker, and that of course influences the evolution of thought process. So, that applies to Plato also. And the two influences which were quite significant on Plato, one was of course his preceptor, his his guru, or one can say his mentor, that was Socrates. Therefore, what has happened, that most of the writings of Plato are in basically in form of a dialogue, and those dialogues are basically Socratic dialogues, because Socrates, a great mind of the Greek period, of course did not write much, and therefore, whatever we know about Socrates are mostly through the writings of the Plato. And what happened, that Socrates not only influenced Plato, but basically laid the foundation of a tradition, and that tradition was kept alive by his disciple, that is Plato. So, in fact, one can say a chain of succession, so far as this political thinking and political tradition is concerned. Socrates' tradition was carried forward by Plato, and Platonic tradition was carried forward by his disciple and his student Aristotle. It is a different matter that Aristotle differed with Plato on many issues, to the extent that Aristotle started critiquing Plato for many of his views, and at times they were diametrically opposed on many issues, in spite of the fact that Aristotle was basically tutored by Plato. He basically learnt at his feet, he joined his academy, and basically when Aristotle was student of Plato's academy, Plato has declared him to be perhaps one of the brilliant and the most fruitful investment of that academy. But that did not basically prevent Aristotle from critiquing his preceptor, that did not prevent Aristotle from critiquing his guru, because the way their methodology, the way their entire approach to society, politics, economy, for the good life, the vision for ideal society and ideal state, they developed, they radically differed and took different trajectory. So, therefore, what happens, that political thought of Plato and Aristotle, in spite of having common bonding, that both belong to the same period, roughly the same period, both basically shared many common things. In fact, both were part of the same academy, and Plato had founded it, and Aristotle was of course educated in that academy. In spite of the fact, the beauty of their political thought is that basically Aristotle subjects the entire Platonic discourse to a rigorous scrutiny and interrogation, and comes out with some very refreshing ideas on number of issues, which perhaps Plato did not address, or even if he addressed, he basically took it, he addressed it totally differently. So, this is something about Plato and Aristotle. Of course, we will be discussing Aristotle in our next lecture, but what I am basically concerned here is this Platonic political thought of Plato, and I was referring to Socrates. Basically, one of the major influences on Plato is of Socrates, and particularly 2-3 issues which can immediately trace back to Socrates, particularly the method of dialectics. I mean, that comes to Plato from Socrates to some extent in form of a dialogue, but of course, there are other traditions, there are other thinkers in the Greek period who had also talked about dialectics. For example, this famous statement that we cannot step twice into the same river, that the reality is ever changing, and therefore, because this is the nature of reality, that reality is not static, but reality is changing. And this statement was also basically very dear to Socrates, that he also believed that reality is ever changing, and therefore, the changing reality has to be understood. But in spite of this changing reality, there is something which is also unchanging, and this is something which basically Plato understood as of idea, or basically of form, the theory of form, that everything has some element within it which is basically not changing, in spite of the fact that reality keeps changing. So, therefore, what is that element which does not change? And it is that element perhaps which is important for philosophy, for understanding the nature of reality, for basically visualizing and imagining the ideal life and ideal society, and therefore, ideal human beings. So, this is the kind of argument which was developed by earlier Greek political philosopher Heraclitus, who said that we cannot step twice into the same river, and laid the foundation for this understanding of changing reality, which became the foundation of this entire method of dialectics. And this was basically incorporated in Socrates' political thought, and that was handed down to Plato. So, therefore, we find that Plato's political thought is evolving in context of the existing Greek tradition, but that did not stop Plato from creatively harnessing the existing knowledge for basically developing a new type of political thinking and tradition, and therefore, Plato's thought is important even today. For example, 3-4 important issues which he addressed in his writings. The most important political writing, of course, is Republic, but one should not forget that the last writing, which also perhaps one of the important milestone in the evolution of his political thought, is Laws. So, therefore, what he proposes in Republic, to some extent he modifies in Laws. If basically in Republic he is living a life in ideal, in fact in Laws he basically tries to transit from ideal to the practical, the empirical, and therefore, in Republic, if he is aspiring for something what is ideal, what is desirable, in Laws what basically he addresses is something what is practicable and what is basically feasible. So, therefore, kind of realism what one finds in Laws is diametrically opposed to what we find in Republic, and how it happened is also something interesting. The long experiences which he underwent, those experiences influenced him tremendously to modify his political thought when he started writing his last treatise called Laws, and that experience itself is significant. When basically he found his master, when he found his guru, his preceptor, when he found his main role model Socrates being persecuted, and basically not only persecuted, but even executed by then existing regime for simply on the charge of instigating or basically infusing idealism and basically idea for change among the younger generations in society. That execution of Socrates completely moved Plato and turned him into a different type of person who basically started looking down upon the entire democratic order, because for Plato democracy is perhaps not the best form of the government, because democracy is not in which the wise people rule. Democracy is not the government in which wisdom matters. Democracy is not a government where efficiency works. So, therefore, he started condemning democratic system, and therefore, he started imagining a society which would be free from these vices, where basically wisdom will prevail, because for Plato, like many other Greek thinkers, virtue is knowledge. So, virtuous life, how one can lead a virtuous life, how one can live a virtuous life, this was the question before him, and he tried to address it through number of ways, through number of means, and philosophy became the main tool for Plato to arrive at this situation. Of course, it is also stated that Plato was living, or Aristotle, or for that matter the Greek society of that period, was a slave society. In fact, it was slavery, it was a highly inegalitarian society. Many people did not have equal rights, many people did not have freedom. For example, slaves, women, alien people, in fact they did not have equality in terms of rights and entitlements. So, therefore, it was an unequal society, it was a slave society. And when Plato talked of a philosopher king, basically idea was to basically create a situation where basically the division in the society, because Greek society, in spite of having this type of inequality, a highly divided society, even the ruling class was highly divided, and therefore number of systems which basically were experimented there is itself a testimony of the fact that how divided that society was. For example, they tried number of regimes over the years. For example, they started, kingship was perhaps the most sought after, the ideal system at one point of time. They started with kingship, that is monarchy, and then transited to oligarchy. And when distortions crept into oligarchy, they basically moved in direction of tyranny, or basically some tyrants, the 30 tyrants as it is commonly referred, the 30 tyrants ruled. And then from the tyranny they moved to aristocracy. Of course, aristocracy was a system which was basically founded with the help of popular support, and from aristocracy they transited to democracy, and therefore all these systems they practiced and experimented, and therefore the follies of all these systems they were quite aware of. So, what happened that when they experimented with these systems, they could see the distortions, the follies, the demerits and deficiencies of each of them, and when they visualize and imagine the ideal system, they try to basically overcome those deficiencies. And therefore, when we come to Aristotle's political thought, when he talked of golden mean, where he tries to combine the best of everything. For example, for him the combination of aristocracy and polity is perhaps the best system through which society can be governed. Thus, golden mean was largely on account of the fact that they did not find, in fact Aristotle also did not find any system foolproof, where you have all the perfections, where you have no problem, where no deficiency. Therefore, the best way to govern is to combine different forms of government. So, this synthesis is perhaps an important feature of Aristotle's political. But coming to Plato, what I was referring to, that the kind of situation which he was encountering, that society was divided, society was encountering number of problems. The biggest problem was the problem of instability and how to overcome that instability, and it was in this context that he started imagining the ideal society, and that ideal society, the blueprint of that ideal society you find in his famous book Republic. Now, what is that ideal society? The ideal society is where the virtue prevails, because virtue is knowledge, and how this virtuous life one can lead, and this is something which basically discusses in form of this ideal republic. The ideal republic, of course, people critique this republic, that is an interesting type of republic, where in the republic you have no public, in fact you have only the rulers. Of course, the public goes out of the purview, because what happens, that whole host of people are excluded from the purview of this society, the slaves and so on and so forth. But of course, the women have the presence, but only among the ruling class, not among the citizenry, among the citizens. So, that is there. Now, this idea of communism is also important, that how he basically prescribed a kind of austere life, the kind of austerity which he prescribed for the guardian class. For example, even the theory of justice, through which he tried to institutionalize a kind of division of labor in society, is quite interesting. That he said that there is tripartite division of soul in every individual, and that tripartite division of soul means that by nature human beings have inclination or proclivity or kind of motivation for particular type of work, and therefore when one follows basically the call of one's nature, this is basically, in Plato's opinion, is true reflection of a just society, that one should be sticking to one's own vocation of life, one should be sticking to one's own basically call of the nature. For example, if someone's personality or someone's a human body is in which you have the courage dominating, then perhaps he is fit to be a soldier. If mind is dominating, then he is fit to be ruler. If someone's appetite is dominating, then he is fit to be the trading class of the society. So, this division, understanding and recognizing one's own character, one's own nature is true justice in Platonic framework, and deviating from this recognition, deviating from this division of labor is basically the violation of this essential norm of justice. So, therefore, what we find that when we find this type of division in human nature, human personality, then one is also reminded of traditional the caste system of Hindu society, particularly this varnashram system, which was basically propagated at one point of time. And it is not just a chance that many people feel that there are a lot of influence or engagement between ancient Greek political thought and Indian political thought, to the extent that many people also believe that Plato had travelled far and wide. He had come to Egypt, and of course, he had travelled to different parts of Europe, but even he visited Egypt. Many scholars or many researchers have also speculated that perhaps he visited as far as the bank of Ganges, but whether that is true or not, one does not know. But one thing is definitely there, that one find some interaction, some influence of Indian political thought on ancient Indian political thinking on the Greek political tradition, and that one can definitely find a commonality in this argument, when basically he is saying that every human being has a division within in terms of essential character and nature, and sticking to that nature and character is basically true justice. So, therefore, one finds the similar argument basically prevalent in this entire Manu Smriti, or this what is known as varnashram and so on and so forth. So, therefore, what I am trying to say, that this theory of justice is also a mechanism through which Plato is trying to envision this ideal society, the ideal society which will be free from all biases and free from all distortions. Now, not only theory of justice, but even the idea of communism, this is something quite significant, because the communist thinking, the ideas of communism in modern times became quite popular, and there were many socialist and the communist thinkers in modern times. Of course, most important being Karl Marx, the German thinker, philosopher. But before Marx also there were utopian socialists, there are communists, in fact, even if not communists in the Marxian sense, but in fact, a lot of people started believing in equality and a kind of justice which argues that each according to ability, each according to need. But what happens, that the first important indication, or the first important example of a communist society arranged and organized on the communist principles, on the principle of communism, we find in Plato. And interestingly, unlike Marxian scheme for communism, in Plato there is a communism of wives and communism of property. It is not only property which should be commonly owned, but even the wives should be commonly owned, for particularly the ruling class, the guardian class. Why? Because he believed that the rulers should have should be under full control. So, therefore, that control will make the system more functional, more legitimate, more acceptable in the eyes of the people. So, what I am trying to argue, that communism, the idea of communism, interesting way of defining communism of wives and communism of property, and then this entire theory of justice, along with a very elaborate scheme of education which Plato proposed and propounded. These are basically the means through which Plato tried to envision an ideal society, and that ideal society in which the state will be more effective in rendering governance to the people. Now, so far as education is concerned, it is such an elaborate discussion on education that one of the modern political thinker, Rousseau, called Republic perhaps the best treatise on education. Instead of a treatise on government and politics, it is the best treatise on education. This is something what Rousseau believed. So, therefore, education, theory of justice, in fact, this communism, all these things are integral part of Plato's political thought, when he comes to envision the ideal society in Greek period. Now, coming to this issue that how he basically came to this idea that only philosopher can rule society, why not others? What is so great about a philosopher king? Because this is something integral to his political thought, because Plato believed that philosophy unites and all other things divide, and therefore, in order to overcome the divisive nature of politics, in order to overcome this divisive nature of government and the rule, the only remedy lies is in making philosopher the king, because philosopher is not concerned with the ordinary things, the mundane things, but rather something more profound, something which is basically not limited but unlimited, that is wisdom, that is knowledge, because there are two types of goods, which are, one is limited goods, another is unlimited goods, and the limited goods are always mundane things. So, basically wisdom is unlimited and philosopher is in possession of wisdom, and therefore, only philosopher has the capability to unite society, because he is not concerned with the limited, but he is concerned with the unlimited. So, this is how he arrives at this idea of a philosopher king. Now, what I was referring to earlier, that why Plato started despising democracy. What was the reason? One of the reasons, normally it is believed that Socrates was executed when he was ordered, when he was poisoned. Now, Socrates' influence on Plato was tremendous, so much so that when Socrates was being executed, Plato started weeping, wallowing, and he broke down. And it was Socrates who said that it was not done, that when this execution was being done, and this was a moment not for basically wallowing, it was not a moment for regret, rather it was a moment to celebrate, and therefore he said that that's why he had not asked any woman to be around in order to avoid that situation. But Plato couldn't resist it, because he was so heavily influenced by the ideas of Socrates that he started thinking that what was the reason that a person like Socrates was executed, and the execution was done by a system which at that time was known as democracy. As I was referring to earlier, democracy, the way today we understand, was not prevalent then. It was highly restricted system of government. Many people were not allowed to participate in the governance or in the deliberation at that time. Of course, the system of rotation was there, the system, to some extent the rule of law was there, but nonetheless the kind of open inclusive democracy we talk of today was totally absent at that time. But nonetheless, that forced Plato to think about this essential folly of this system called democracy, and that took him to this entire discourse of this ideal system, the ideal republic, which will be ruled by philosopher, where there will be a particular type of system of justice, where there will be particular type of education, and so on and so forth. Now, what is interesting here to see that Plato, before taking to all these things, took to certain philosophical discourses, and that is very common with all philosophers, and those methodological issues which Plato grappled with and basically brought into discussion while he was basically reflecting on these issues are also quite significant. As I was referring to, one of the important tool in his entire discourse was the dialectical method. Now, dialectics is basically is a tradition which is prevalent even today. Now, of course, thesis, antithesis and synthesis, this is a common formula through which people understand dialectics. Negation of negation, that Hegelian tradition. But in Plato, what we find that dialectics comes in form of dialogues, and therefore what happens that most of his writings are arranged in form of a dialogue, the Socratic dialogue. But what happens that in dialogues or conversations, the questions comes as a thesis and the answers as basically antithesis, and therefore when the two things are conflict with each other, then it is believed that a third thing may emerge, and that will be the synthesis, the best of the two. And therefore, this dialectical method basically he invokes and he practices. As I was mentioning, that this tradition of course was handed over to him from his predecessors, Heraclitus and many others. and Socrates was of course one prominent name. But not only that, there were other methods. For example, geometry was of tremendous importance for him, mathematics was of tremendous importance for him, so much so that when he founded this academy in Athens, what happened that it was written on the main door that anyone without knowledge of mathematics cannot enter the precincts of that academy. So, basically mathematics was important thing. For example, Pythagoras theorems were important in his entire art of or the craft of geometry was of tremendous importance to Plato. So, therefore, Plato was making use of number of things. For example, one important philosophical method that is called teleology was of course common and prevalent in the Greek tradition, but Plato also popularized that teleology. That the teleology, the argument is that everything has a purpose. Basically everything, everyone has a nature, and that nature has a purpose, and that movement toward that purpose is the end of the fulfillment of the nature of the thing. Now, this teleological method was also practiced by Aristotle in a big way, and what we find therefore that this teleology as it is commonly understood that in Greek period that the state came into existence for sake of good life and continued for for that is basically well known statement, and this was referred as this is referred today as a teleological method or a statement, teleological statement. So, Plato in fact started using this teleology along with dialectics, along with both inductive and deductive reasoning, and later on came out with some interesting argument on number of things. Now, what happened that ethics as it is normally understood was very important thing for Greek political thinkers. Now, ethics was the foundation of good life. Now, what happened? Politics was normally understood as sequel of ethics. Ethics, there was no separation between ethics and politics the way it was done in modern period of time, particularly the most important, one of the founding fathers of modernity, the Machiavelli, when he talked of separation between ethics and politics, we get a diametrically opposite picture of the thing. But for Plato, politics is a sequel of ethics. One cannot separate the two things. Now, what happened? This politics ethics combination, of course, in India also we have had very powerful exposition of this thing in the political thought of Gandhi much later. But in Greek tradition, ethics was something which was very important, and politics was always considered an ethical activity. Therefore, in fact, when Aristotle said that man is a political animal and without politics the existence of man is unthinkable, he was basically referring to this dimension, that basically the human existence, the human identity is fulfilled and completed only by participation in politics. And ethics, of course, politics was only the extension of ethics. Now, another important thing one should bear in mind while discussing Plato is the distinction which he made between episteme and doxa, the two important differentiation. Now, this theory and knowledge discussion is also quite significant. Now, what happens that Plato makes a distinction between episteme and doxa, and he says that episteme one can have only about those things which are permanent or there is a permanence in it, but doxa one can have opinion, and opinion one can have only about those things which are changing. So, there is basically two types of distinction, that one can have episteme about basically that is knowledge, and doxa that is opinion. So, you can form a knowledge not about everything, but only those things which are not really transitory, which are not transient, which are not changing. But doxa one can have about things which are changing, which are transient and which are transitory. Now, similarly, what happens that when Plato and many other Greek thinkers talked of epistemology, that epistemology included both science and knowledge, unlike today when we make a distinction between science and philosophy. Plato and others did not make a distinction between science and philosophy, because today when we talk of this distinction, what we understand that philosophy stands for abstract things, whereas the science stands for empirical things, but that was not the case then. when they talked of science and philosophy, they basically both were part of the episteme. Similarly, when it came to theory, the Plato talked of theoria and the praxis. Now, theoria of course was the pure knowledge, and the praxis was of course applied knowledge. Now, of course, this pure knowledge, that is theoria, was basically what is normally understand today as theory, was end, but the practical knowledge, that is praxis, as means. Now, one can have theory about truth, one can have theory about good, one can have theory about beauty, one can have theory about pure knowledge, but one cannot have theory about agriculture, one cannot have theory about carpentry, because these are the realms of applied knowledge. So, therefore, pure knowledge and applied knowledge, this distinction is also equally significant as the distinction between episteme and doxa, as I mentioned, between opinion and knowledge, about applied and abstract, about pure and impure. So, this is how one can say, and this pure knowledge in the Greek tradition as a whole and in Plato's also stands for basically virtue, and virtue, as I mentioned, that leading a virtuous life was basically the goal of that society, and that was the ideal which was cherishable for them. So, therefore, good life is basically the ideal for which both of them both Plato and Aristotle aspired for, and all Greek traditions also talked of. Now, looking at these methodological issues, what one finds that when it came to this imagining a basically the ideal system, what was that ideal system? Now, of course, in Plato we find two different types of ideal system. One ideal system we find which is available in his book Republic, but Republic was written when he was at the peak of his basically his youth, or one can say when he was young, when he was maturing as a political thinker. But the second system, or the blueprint of the system, we find in the second writing in terms of this political treatise, that is Laws, and it was written at the fag end of his career, fag end of his life. Now, what happened, that why this is a matter of a speculation, that why he transited from Republic to Laws, why he basically talked of philosopher king or the rule of philosophy in Republic, and why he talked of rule of law in Laws, why he basically believed that the rule of the philosopher is not feasible and practicable, why he wanted to modify it. And it is in this context that one has to take into account his varied and diverse experiences which he gathered, as it is well known that after the execution of his master Socrates, he was totally disillusioned, and he started moving from place to place, and he was invited by one monarch to come and establish his academy there. He was invited to come and train his son as a philosopher for that ideal society, and he accepted the invitation. He went there, he started teaching him, but he discovered that that was not delivering the result, and then of course he was totally disillusioned, and because of the various experiences which he gathered over the years, Plato started believing that perhaps the rule of the philosopher is of course the best, but that is not feasible, and that feasibility factor perhaps propelled him to think in terms of the second best. If the first best is the rule of the philosopher king, the second best is of course rule of the law, and this is what we find in the second book, that is Laws. Now, it is interesting to see that he considered his second best, that is rule of law, and his disciple Aristotle moved from altogether a different premise, and he arrives at a conclusion that Plato's second best is his first best. That means the rule of the law, and basically the kind of blueprint which he puts in Laws became most popular with Aristotle, so far as his political thought is concerned. And it is not only that, on many issues Aristotle started deviating from his master. So, it is not just a chance that when Aristotle started critiquing Plato during his lifetime, Plato believed that Aristotle was doing a great disservice to the great knowledge which acquired in his academy, and he was not all too happy, but still he did not rusticate Aristotle from academy. Rather, he was always welcome because he considered Aristotle to be one of the best products of his academy. So, Aristotle what he does, if Plato talks of communism of wives, if Plato wants to banish property from the life of the rulers, if Plato tries to destroy the institution of family, basically Aristotle totally disagrees with Plato and basically considers all three of them to be important. Rather, when he comes to the definition of a state, he said that a state is association of families, and therefore what happens, that family becomes very important unit in Aristotle's political thought. But for Plato, family was one of the most corrupting institution. Therefore, unless this institution of family along with property, they are reined in, there will be no escape from the vices, there will be no escape from the problems and instability which the Greek society was facing. And therefore, what happens in Plato, in Plato's Platonic communism, the two things are targeted, the family and the property. Property, of course, even today we know whenever we talk of communism, property becomes the important unit of analysis, that is equitable distribution of resources, ownership pattern, that if people own beyond a proportion, then there will be inequality, there will be exploitation. So, the property aspect of course is not surprising, but what is interesting is this family aspect, that he also wants to destroy family, and therefore, this communism of wives, that everything should be held in common like property, the common ownership. This is what he believed that will be the best antidote to, or the best remedies through which the ills and distortions of society could be checked and controlled. But not only that, I was referring to education. Education is an important theme in both Plato and Aristotle, and when Plato talks of education, what he says, that only through education that people's temperance of soul can be maintained, that this balance, the internal balance within the various aspects of soul can be maintained, because this tripartite division of soul, as I was mentioning earlier, which is basically the backbone of the theory of justice, sticking to that. So, therefore, there is no institutional mechanism for delivery of justice as it is commonly understood in modern times. It was totally abstract philosophical discourse on justice, but to some extent one can say that there was a force, logical force in this argument, that justice means basically doing things according to one's own calling. So, basically virtues in action was basically the main mantra of this theory of justice, that every virtues is basically this sticking to one's own nature, and this virtue if is in action, then one can say that true and truly a just society is in existence. Now, of course, this entire thing, this idea of communism of wives, property, education, and the rule of the philosopher, all these things were part of the larger political scheme which Plato proposed for his ideal republic in that book called Republic. But interestingly, what happens, that Plato brought into discussion number of philosophical arguments, and therefore argued with a philosophical reasoning. It was not just that illogical reasoning he was providing for, and it is in this logical reasoning, this philosophical discourse, we find that there is a very important argument in Plato, that is the theory of form. And this theory of form is something on basis of which he basically argues for this ideal system, the ideal republic. And this form is something which one should definitely take into consideration. That he said that the form, that there is a form of, everything has a form, and then everything has expression. The form is the real part, the true part, the truth lies in the form, not in expression. And every expression is the appearance, and basically this appearance seeks to model itself on basis of the form. For example, there is a horse, and horse is a form, horse is appearance, but there is an idea of that form, that is there is idea of that appearance, that is the idea of horse. So, everything has an idea and everything has an expression. So, this relationship between form and expression, this gap exists, but nonetheless the purpose and ideal of everything is to model on the pattern of that form or that idea. So, therefore, this is one thing very important. So, the second thing which he also uses in his thought is analogy and this and metaphor. This analogy is something quite important. For example, analogy of cave as it is popularly called in Plato. He says that everything only the truth, everyone can't see the truth, only the philosopher can see the truth, others can only see the shadow of truth. Like a captive in a cage, a prisoner in a cave can see only the shadow of light and believes that it is light, but it is not light, it is shadow. So, only the philosopher can see the real truth, others can only see the appearance. So, this way the metaphor, for example, he uses metaphor at several places. He said why philosophers should rule. Philosophers should rule simply because philosophers are more competent and more qualified people in the society, therefore, they can rule. He gives the example, he gives the metaphor of a doctor, that if someone falls ill, then whom one would prefer to call to treat him or her? Definitely a qualified person, not anyone would be invited for giving him a treatment. So, basically this qualification is there simply because he believes that a qualified person can cure him. So, therefore, when society is in problem, the society is in turmoil, then who should be invited to rule? Not everyone, but only qualified people, and qualified people are normally those who are basically looking at things in a more holistic purpose, more totality, and totality can be seen only through episteme, not through doxa, and totality can be only approached through philosophy, and therefore, the rule of the philosophy is justified. So, therefore, one can see that all these arguments are philosophically grounded, philosophically defended, philosophically articulated. But one thing is definitely there, that Plato's thought, of course, over the years has also been subjected to rigorous criticism, that why Plato provides this type of argument, what is the reason? For example, one reason at times people believe that his basically own personal experience influenced him to come out with many of these arguments, and one of the personal experience was, of course, number A, the Socrates execution, number 2, his attempt to influence some of the existing monarchies and turn them into philosopher king, and when they fail, then of course he tried to modify his argument in that famous book Laws. But then apart from that, the most important criticism is that Greek society was a slave society, and slave society had a different type of contradictions, and Plato and many other thinkers of that period were trying to basically negotiate with those contradictions, and those contradictions were best reflected in the argument on philosopher king, justice, so on and so forth. But still we believe that the Plato's argument, some of the arguments are still quite powerful and quite important, so much so that even today when we find that the modern political thought, when talks of number of things, basically they keep referring to Plato and Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle is more important in social science, because in political science he is also referred as the father of political science, because most of the methodological breakthrough which he gave through his writings are still significant, whether it is a comparative method, whether it was the empirical art of research, whether it was the way he deliberated on government, constitutions, so on and so forth. So, of course, Aristotle is more significant for a discipline like political science, but nonetheless Plato and Aristotle together are basically indispensable for the study of political thought, in spite of the fact that the modern period broke radically from the ancient and the medieval period, but some of the issues which they addressed at that time still become the reference point for the modern thinkers. For example, even the question of justice today, of course, justice is perceived as an institutional phenomenon, that justice cannot be thought of in society without having a proper institutions for it. One of the most eminent philosopher of contemporary, the recent times, Rawls, when he talked of justice, he basically wanted to create an institutional format, institutional framework for delivery of justice. When we compare the modern theory of justice with Plato's theory of justice, of course being distributive, but nonetheless the entire format is different. It is more abstract. It is totally separated and insulated from institutional design. Rather, it is basically based on one's own nature, character, to some extent reminiscent of what Gandhi used to say, that for creating a just society, that human being should basically try to model or mold one's nature according to the requirement of the fellow beings or requirement of the society. To the extent that Gandhi also proposed that people should try to basically create a society where there is a harmony, and that harmony is based on basically a coexistence, and that coexistence should be also dependent on people's recognition of each other's needs, and that need is basically also contingent on recognition of one's own character and one's own nature. So, it is not that only the ancient thinkers like Plato talked of justice in this framework, but this disillusionment with institutional discourse on justice is even in modern times, and in 20th century one of the eminent Indian thinker Gandhi also visualized justice outside the framework of institutions, so on and so forth. But in Plato, of course, his entire discourse was more philosophically grounded. It was basically in terms of number of things, the way he looked at philosophy, the way he wanted to create the rule of the philosopher, the way he believed that philosophy is basically non-divisive, other things are divisive, and then basically how this wisdom, knowledge and wisdom, how they can be acquired. And here there are many things. I was referring to this commonality between Indian philosophy and the Greek philosophy, and one thing I am reminded of is also basically this immortality of soul and transmigration of soul, the two important things which you also find in Plato as it is there in Indian philosophy. And therefore, it is not surprising, as I mentioned earlier, that many people believe that of course he travelled to the Egypt as it is recorded, but perhaps he might have travelled to India also. But even if he did not travel, the influence of India of course is quite palpable on Plato. And therefore, this transmigration of soul, immortality of soul, and by giving this argument of immortality of soul and transmigration of soul, Plato basically integrates it with the larger philosophical discourse, that how wisdom from one life to another life can pass, and how it can be more enabling and enriching for the philosopher, king, and for philosopher to rule. So, this is broadly one can say that whole gamut of argument or the political thought which basically emerges from the Greek tradition, and in the hands of Plato it becomes more profound, it becomes more more universal, and that is why it has acquired the stature of classics, that even today when we talk of political thought, we essentially refer to when we talk of the classics in political thought, we essentially refer to a Greek political tradition. At times, as I was telling you, that a question emerged, why do you study classic, what is so important? Their situation was different, their society was different. In what way the study and understanding of the society can help us today? But the fact of the matter is that of course the situation has changed. It was a slave society. I told you that many people were excluded from the purview of citizenship. In fact, women, slaves, and many other people were not part of the citizens. But nonetheless, the issues which they raised, the philosophical questions which they posed are still important. Some of the questions of course we are trying to address in a different way, whether it is art of government or art of management of economy. For example, the self-sufficiency of city states, of course, as it is known that those societies were direct democracy, because direct participation of the people, and they were not representative democracy like today. Now, today when we talk of democracy, we have a different format, different framework to govern the society. Now, what happened those days, democracy in the political thought of Plato and Aristotle was not the best form of government, but today of course we consider democracy to be the best form of government. The situation has changed. The democracy in their opinion was responsible for committing many vices, but today we believe, after today rather we understand democracy as the best form of government, largely because of the fact that when we compare democracy with other forms of government, we discover that democracy is still most effective a form of government in which the voice and opinions of the people matter. Of course, the people's opinion mattered even then, but only handful of people, and therefore they were prone to distortions and they were prone to corruption. So, in fact, for them it was a corrupt form of government, but that is no longer the case with us. So, what has happened therefore, that some of the systems which are prevalent today and were perhaps prevalent then also in a different framework have delivered differently in two periods of time, and therefore ideas differ. But the nature of argument, the way they wanted to basically look at things, the approach, that is quite significant. It is largely on account of these issues that we basically try to study these classics and take the benefit from their ideas and knowledge to understand our own social and political challenges. Our challenges have been totally different in modern times. As I was telling you that it was a self-sufficient, self-reliant, small society, the city states. Now, today of course, we can't think of a city states. All states are big in size and content, but those societies were quite small. The governance, the problems of governance in that society was also different, but our problems are radically different from not only the Greek period, but of course even the periods which succeeded that medieval period. But nonetheless, the wisdom, the knowledge, the philosophical insights, and the way they try to reflect on number of things have become a source of inspiration for many generations which have come after Plato. Now, in the next lecture we will look at Aristotle, that how Aristotle, as I was mentioning you, that one of the student of his academy, because Plato is credited with the idea of founding the first important academy at that period of time. But Aristotle was a student of that academy, but even when he was being taught by Plato, he started looking at the limitations of Plato's thought, and the three important components of Plato's thought, that was this property, family and the state, completely got transformed in the hands of Aristotle, and he started looking at something which was more feasible, which was not only abstract, but also workable and was more desirable. So, therefore, Aristotle's critique of Plato became the foundation of Aristotle's political thought, on basis of which he developed his entire argument in his famous book called Politics. If Plato's Republic was the beginning of a new tradition, Aristotle took that discourse to a new height in his writing, that is called Politics. So, we will basically take up Aristotle in our next lecture.
I am sorry, sir, for interrupting. Thank you for this interesting lecture, and since we have no time left, we are binding this lecture session without posing any question. Thank you so much, sir.